Hello, welcome everyone to this very exciting Tech23 Impact Circle. Today we're going to be exploring circular economy, waste as a resource in the built environment. Now, we'd like to welcome you all, and it's wonderful to have you join us for what's sure to be a great discussion. As is custom, I would like to acknowledge both the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and the Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where the Slattery's team meets, works and creates. We pay our respects to the elders both past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge that today people are attending from other traditional lands and nations and extend our respects to their custodians, ancestors, elders and future leaders. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Good to see you here, Rachel.
Hello, Adina, and welcome to everyone Zooming in. A special welcome and thank you to our contributors today, Sophia, Ali, Steve, Tim and Usha, and led by the capable Matt. Thank you all for letting us eavesdrop on today's conversation. I, for one, am very much looking forward to learning a little bit more about this area. One of the best things about zooming in on these circles is for us to reach people from all across Australia. So please say hello on the chat, introduce yourselves and tell us where you're zooming in from. Tech23 has always been about amplifying the people and the organisations chipping away at the biggest challenges we face. We've been running lots of circles over the last couple of months, and if you haven't been able to get to hear any of those, the recordings are all available on the website. Coming to any which way this year, Tech23 is going to be also shining a light on 23 high growth companies with great potential. So stay tuned when we announce them next week. We're also looking forward to meeting up in the flesh next week. We've got a long lunch planned on Thursday for those lucky enough to get to Sydney. So I'm very excited about that as well. Again, to all of those on the line, a warm welcome. Please ask your questions via the chat or to Adina or I privately. Share your takeaways on the mural, and time permitting, we'll be breaking into smaller groups at the end of the conversation. So please enjoy. And Adina, you've got a few more reminders.
That I do. Thank you very much, Rachel. You would have seen in your reminder and the Zoom chat, there is a link to the Slattery's Community Charter, which is a good read if you need some guidance on what kind of behaviour and discourse is encouraged at the circles. Just to confirm, as Rachel mentioned, we will be kicking off the conversation with Matt and contributors, followed by audience Q&A from all of you. So please do pop them into the chat as you go, and also raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question live. Now, we are using a mural board, which we will drop in the chat now, to capture your thoughts and squiggles and stickies, burning questions or whatever else. Please feel free to add. And just a note, we will be recording this presentation and we'll make it available post-event so you can revisit. As Rachel mentioned, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to every one of the Circle contributors today and for all of them, and all of the Tech23 sponsors and supporters for helping today's session and indeed Tech23 2020 come into being. We also want to thank all of you for joining us. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Matt to kick things off. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Adina, and welcome everyone. I'd like to also add my acknowledgement to country to the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we conduct the university's business, RMIT. So welcome everybody. It's a wonderful group that we have here today, and a terrific discussion about something that just before the call started, we were just reflecting on how much the momentum seems to be behind circular economy more broadly, but certainly the waste side of it is really gaining momentum, which is terrific. So I wanted to give a chance for each of our contributors just to introduce themselves, let us know who they are, but also what they're excited about in that sort of growing field. So perhaps Sophia, I might throw to you first.
Hi everybody, my name's Sophia Hamblin Wang and I'm the COO of MCI, Mineral Carbonation International. We transform carbon dioxide into building materials and other valuable industrial products. We primarily focus right now on things like cement and concrete bricks and plasterboards. but working particularly with the cement and steel industry and the hard to abate sectors to view their emissions as a resource and not just a harmful waste, which, we'll talk a lot about during this session. I'm also a founding director of a think tank called CO2 Value Australia, which advocates for all technologies that turn CO2 into materials like fuels and chemical feedstocks and all kinds of other building materials. So yeah, feel free to get in touch if you're interested to know more about that.
Awesome. And I think those bricks are the new business card, right? We're sort of taking them and demonstrating what's possible. Thank you. Awesome to have you here. Ali, can I throw to you next? Handball across to you.
Got it. Yeah, Ali Khalifa. So I'm the founder of DesignBox, which is a sustainable innovation firm back in the US. I'm happy to be in Australia for the past year and a half, working with iAccelerate, mentoring startups on their sustainable innovation, and in the interim have now become the project director of Plastic Collective, which is working with remote and vulnerable communities to harvest ocean plastic and reverse the tide on maritime waste.
Wonderful, awesome work. Steve, I might throw the ball to you, or the up in my top corner there.
Yeah, got it. Thanks, Matt. And yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here. Two hats, one as the Australian Circular Economy Hub. So in my role there, I'm kind of like an ambassador, you might say. So I bring people together and I help to create relationships, collaboration, emotional intelligence, such an important part of the circular economy. Another hat as founder of Close the Loop, very interested in the materials recovery, resource recovery, keeping atoms and molecules in circulation for longer. And dare I say it, that word that's not allowed in circular economy these days, recycling. But proudly, I'm involved in that space too. Good to be here, and I'm excited about all of the above.
Wonderful, awesome to have you here, mate. Tim, all the way over from Perth, if I can pass across to you, mate.
Good morning, everybody. It is morning over here still, so I'm joining you from sunny Fremantle. So I am a PhD researcher at CUSP, which is Curtin University Sustainable Policy Institute. As part of my PhD research, we've designed and developed a case study, which was actually a full-size building. So it's a modular building based on the circular economy concept. It's called the Legacy Living Lab, and I'm sitting here now 2 years in and very proud to be showing it off to the people of Western Australia and boosting circular economy and construction, and so happy to share it with all of you great people.
Awesome, mate. How cool is it to call like a building a case study? I love, if that's not the definition of translation of research, I'm not sure what is. So wonderful to have you. Really keen to dig into that a bit more. And finally, certainly last but not least, Usha, one of my wonderful colleagues from RMIT. I'll pass back to you over here in Victoria.
Thanks, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from the lands of the Woi-wurrung and the Woi-wurrung tribes of the Kulin Nation. I am professor at RMIT University at the School of Property, Construction and Project Management, and I also co-lead the One Planet Network Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program for the UN. And we've just released, actually a couple of weeks ago, 8 reports looking at the state of play of circular built environment across 8 different regions. I can send you a link if anyone is interested. Thanks, Matt. Over to you.
I think everyone on the call would be interested in that, and that might be a really great spot to start. I think as we were talking before, we mentioned the momentum and what's happening in each of our different circles and communities, from the UN reports released recently to Sophia's World Economic Forum video and getting the profile there post Davos, and to Steve and the ACE Hub. I really want to dig into, are we seeing the froth and bubble? Or is there real traction happening? What's the state of play in your communities and your groups? And Usha, I'll let you continue with what some of the came out of those 8 reports, because that was truly global, right?
Yes, we initially, when we started off, the idea of developing these state of play reports was actually last year at the World Circular Economy Forum in Helsinki. And at that time, our intent was to, and as the UN's responsibility and mantle is really to focus on the developing rather than the developed nations. And so we sort of started thinking of in this journey of what is it that we could do to help the developing world. But it was quite important in the journey to really understand what is going on in the developed world, so we can use some of those learnings and the mistakes that have already been made by the developed world to fast track learning into the developing world. So that's what led us to develop these 7 different regional reports, topped with the global report that comes up with policies and recommendations. So the various regions are Oceania, Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America, Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and Europe. And understandably, Europe has been on this trajectory for a much longer period of time than all the other regions. And also understandably, there are regional variations. And for us, this was a very, very interesting observation to make.
Yeah, yeah. And Sophia, I'm really excited about the World Economic Forum piece, I guess you could tell. But clearly that sort of level of recognition about carbon dioxide abatement, and I think your example was around the cliffs of Dover, and the world's been doing this for millions of years. You've found a way to do it in hours. What's happening in your space, and what do you see as really exciting and real, not just sort of platitudes and language?
Thanks, Matt. I mean, it's kind of it's really exploded this year, the whole concept of circular carbon. At the beginning of the year, I was in Davos at the actual World Economic Forum speaking on a panel. Actually, Ali, you'll be interested. It was with William McDonough, who wrote Cradle to Cradle, and talking about how carbon dioxide isn't in itself an evil thing. And if you treat it as a resource, you can unlock all kinds of innovation potential. But, this is in January when quite a lot of the world's largest companies made statements that they were going to commit to net zero by 2050, and some even made negative emissions claims. In this whole, the 12 months that have passed since then, there has just been an explosion of companies really looking at circularity with regard to carbon, and really thinking beyond just what are we going to do, where can we put carbon, where should we put carbon? Now it's more, what could we embed carbon into in order to be more innovative and to create whole new products? So just recently, I was invited to present at a World Economic Forum Pioneers of Change conference. It was the first of its kind. And actually, this year's the first year the World Economic Forum has even talked about circular carbon. They have a whole circular economy focus, but this is a focus on carbon. And the panel that I spoke on was about embedding CO2 into our built environment. So it was so amazing to be involved with business leaders who are wanting to know what can exist in the world. And off the back of that, there's been an explosion of interest all the way up to the WEF doing an article on circularity and the carbon capture and use, which is the technology group that I work on. Carbon capture and use and utilization has been really struggling for any airtime, because obviously carbon capture and storage or underground injection of CO2 has taken lots of attention and funding. So my space is super exciting, mostly because now we know it's around a $6 trillion industry right now in the world that Australia can really be capitalizing on and creating value. Matt, do you mind if I say just a little bit more? I don't want to take too much time.
Well, yeah, look, I think I might throw to Steve next, because I think drawing us back to Australia and what that stuff means would be great. But yeah, Sophia, I'll give you a couple more seconds.
No, I'm happy to speak later. That's fine. Yeah.
Top. So Steve, I wanted to pull it back to Australia because we saw the ACE Hub launch last week, and 1,200 people and ministers up, sort of rah-rahing. It seems like it's all. To both what Usha and Sophia said, it's all coming together. Is that your sense as well?
Well, let's say the hype is growing. The actual traction, I'm not sure that there's a huge change lately, although we do have a waste crisis in this country, which is which, if you like, has facilitated the government spending reasonable amounts of money in the name of circularity. And so from that perspective, there is a lot of investment going on, and but I believe some of it's ill-directed. When we're talking about circularity, the most important, well, only one small part of what's important is the fact that raw materials need markets, and we can't keep throwing money at infrastructure. And this is related to the built environment. We can't keep throwing money at infrastructure unless we've got markets for the products of recycled content. So that's the ACE Hub is very clear on building those markets and raising awareness about that important issue. But other areas, Matt, that are growing are metrics, and the states, every state in the country has a small team of people now starting to look at how we're going to measure circularity. And the ACE Hub has a central position to create, if you like, Australia's circularity gap report, and to get that gap report in the right form that can feed into a global circularity gap report.
Great. And, that's an awesome ambition, and something that'll really give us a good way to understand benchmarking against what best practice looks like. I know, Ali, we were talking about this earlier, that for something like that to work, language matters, and the way that we calibrate how we talk about things, and cradle to cradle is part of that. I know you mentioned end of life versus end of use. You know, how important is it to get us much tighter and clearer on the language you use to describe this sector, and the way that we might measure change and impact?
Oh, it's, you know, let's say as a married man, I've learned it's very important to be precise with my language, you know.
Indeed.
And that applies just as much into, you know, sustainability and everything else, you know, that your language defines your intention. And if you're not really precise with what you're the words that you're using while you're talking about the kinds of sustainable impact that you want to take, then you'll probably miss the mark. So, you know, as soon as you talk about end of life versus end of use, that's a perfect one. I think, you know, a good one, going to Sophia, talking about like circular carbon, there was, you know, an article in Nature by McDonough talking about a new language for carbon, where you talk about living carbon, durable carbon, or fugitive carbon. And so, you know, the fugitive carbon is that carbon that's left a circular system, whether it's, you know, biological or technical, but it's gone into CO2 in the air, or a lot of the work that I'm doing is working with plastics in the ocean. Either way you look at it, these are resources that have gone fugitive, and in the wrong concentration are toxic. So a lot of times when I talk to people about, you know, about ocean plastic, I just ask them, what's their fugitive carbon policy? And they'll look at me blankly, and I'll say, well, do you do anything about CO2? Yeah. So you only care about carbon in the gas form and not any of the other forms that are poisoning our environment. So it's one of those things, like, until you kind of wrap your head around, you know, characterizing what the actual challenges we have, then it's going to be really hard to address them.
And I think that just underpins this systems thinking approach that needs to really permeate through, you know, interventions. And I want to draw to you, Tim, around, as I said at the start, the case study, which is a building, but obviously the lack of innovation in the construction industry has probably been also because it has found that there's been a lack of digitization, a lack of in that sector relative to other industries. So that means competitive decreases, means productivity decreases. Tell me how you and the living lab there, or the lab there, are really looking to address that lack of innovation in the construction sector, and how you might digitize processes in a systems way to have a bit of an impact.
So it was extremely difficult for me and my team, and my research partner Roberto and my professor Greg, because what we had to do was basically come to an industry, especially in WA, where they are very stuck in a building methodology that for Australia-wide is still 30 years behind before we started. And then we built this building in a modular sense. So for us, the idea, and carbon embedding was good, and we can use carbon in concrete, which is great and works for a few other good things. But for this building, we tried to use no concrete because of its high CO2 emissions. So the building in a technology sense sits on a new steel micropole footing. So we've avoided 20 tons of concrete and we've used 600 kilograms of steel. Now, when we plan to move this building, because a lot of our research, we looked at the time in which buildings get demolished, so how long they're actually standing for, and how long is it going to take before that site gets knocked down and another 3 apartments get built there. We can actually take this building and move it as it is. So the building doesn't have an end of life. It's got an end of use in this spot, and we'll take it somewhere else. So for us to work through all those designs in being able to have a building that was essentially an 8-module bolted assembly that can get removed from site with no waste produced from foundations and concrete was quite important to us. But we also found that when we were gathering information and when we were going out to the demolition contractors, there was no system in place where we could adequately find out what was on site without going to a demolition yard and sifting through the waste to find what we could use or what we needed. And there was no centralized database where we could look at who had secondhand or previously used materials. So for example, the carpet tiles in this building are 100% reused. So someone had an office space, it sat for 2 years without being used. And then when they managed to lease the office space, they said, oh, the carpet tiles are dated, we want them ripped up. So a brand new product like that existed, and it wasn't, the only reason we got that is because we rang every single carpet tile distributor that we had, that we could work out where we could get these materials and sort it through. So a lot of what we've done is the hard way. Now we're trying to look at systems and get everyone into the space to create an easier way. And Steve Morris, I will just touch on, fingers crossed, hopefully there's a new circular indexing system that will be published very shortly.
There you go. And so, yeah, I guess that's a good point. Like, what are the, when you looked at that, and I'll throw it to anyone of the group, you know, is there anywhere where we've seen examples globally where that type of digitization to easily enable that, you know, not having to ring whatever it was, 30 carpet tile removers? Is there some examples of that that are showing good promise? You know, where I know, Steve, you mentioned, you know, the close tie-ins with the groups in the Netherlands and some wonderful things happening in Europe. Are there any examples that we can really draw into the Australian context?
Yeah, there's I was just going to mention, I've seen some work at Nextech by Ed Kozior, who has been able to kind of have like an iridescent, or you can use UV type inks on single-use packaging that would then clearly identify, you know, when it goes to, you know, municipal recovery facility, hey, this is PET at this grade, at this, you know, strength and this melt flow index, and hey, this is this other thing. And that way you could actually have, you know, a bona fide extended producer responsibility system, so people can really take credit for those materials. And if you put it out there, you should take it back, kind of thing, or else find a way to kind of trade those kilograms of materials. So you can do it, and especially, you know, on a consumer facing thing, you just need the right wavelength to actually detect it, and you don't really have any anything else that's really going to impact sales by taking up too much real estate of, you know, a beautiful photograph that marketing wants. You can put, you know, some of these kinds of tracer systems in there, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be on everything we put out there.
Steve?
Sustainability Victoria have a directory, which is quite helpful, because there's, you know, you sort of self-populate the directory if you're a supplier of materials that have reached the end of their first use. And there are other directories specific to different industries. So what the Australian Circular Economy Hub is doing right now is halfway through a scoping study to work out what is the best way to solve the problem that we're all discussing here. How do we have a portal where people can come in the front and then go out to their various industries to find out the you know, the embodied energy that's out there and available to be reused. But interestingly enough, it is an area that is fairly slow to get traction.
And I suppose there's two elements to that digitization. There's the aggregation, a portal to be able to access the information, yeah, accurately, quickly. But then there's the markers and the efficiencies that we can use technology to, yeah, at that end point, be able to move more quickly to reuse or recategorization. Sophia, you know, obviously the work you're doing is right at the end of that quite technical spectrum. I wonder what some of the challenges you've overcome to really have the impact that the group's starting to have?
So we've designed our full, so we've been funded for the last 7 years from the New South Wales government, federal government and industry. But the way that we were always set up was in full life cycle assessments in every industrial integration of our process. Because we knew that if we, like, for one, you don't want to be creating a building product that creates more CO2 than is locked away inside it. And so we always needed to know that when we're making a net zero comment or even a negative emissions building material comment, that we would have to verify absolutely, because we actually build our company based upon locking away as much carbon as possible, not to make as much money as possible. But I think it's quite interesting because there are competitors now that are entering the market that are making claims without having that same robustness behind them. And I think that's a real danger in our industry now, is that the appetite for green building products is there, and we really do need to ensure that we've got really good standards for both safety but also verification of green credentials, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, and Usha, I might throw to you, because in the state of play reports, there was I've read a bit of the North American one, and it talked about that issue and the use of incentives to sort of drive the right behaviours and the right accountability. Can you kind of comment on that a little bit? And again, as I said, North America, but obviously out of the other 8 or the other 7 reports, there's probably other examples.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think I would like to just respond to a point that Steve made earlier, and Ali as well. And I think that's to do with the importance of tracking and tracing systems in the built environment. So if you have to reuse materials or repurpose materials, then we really need to understand what the composition of these materials are, so it makes it easier to use in second and third life. So coming to the question that you raised about the North America report, in particular, the North America report focused a lot on the LEED tool and how LEED has permeated into the green building movement in North America. And I think you can see similar parallels here in Australia through the Green Building Council of Australia as well. And I think these sort of movements are really important to push the industry to innovate, to bring in best practice, and to set up new targets. But then you also need to have the minimum standards and the minimum practice, and that also needs to keep up. And this is a quandary that we see in a lot of the emerging regions of the world, where they don't have these minimum standards. And so they're sort of, trying to emulate the same trajectory that Australia or the US or Europe has followed, and they can actually fast track their movement. So if there is opportunities to put track and trace, which I'm told by IT professionals is very, very easy to do. You have that for food labels. So why couldn't you have something similar for building products, so that at the end of life, you could deconstruct buildings and reuse those materials again? So my vision is that in 20 or 30 years' time, you actually have buildings that are built without virgin material use at all. So everything is through the use of materials that are already out there, and at the same time also ticking the box in terms of carbon capture.
And Tim, I've seen a photo of your one of the sites, the building. I think Landcorp donated a site for you to store what seemed like hundreds of pieces of reusable construction waste as sort of like a depot, was my sense of it. Is that accurate? Are you starting to sort of gather all that in and then find ways to check items in and check them out? How are you grappling with that?
No, that wasn't on this site, but that picture was from one of the demolition yards that we had. Right. So a big one for me, and the issue that needs to be unlocked, is when you're a building designer, you need to be able to know what materials you're using in the design phase. So at the moment, we have to go to a yard, find the materials, but there's no way. And when I talked about digitization, I think my next thing, and if anyone wants to help me do this as the next part of research, they're more than welcome to reach out. But we need a way where we can scan construction materials and get a 3D image of those so we can use them in building information modeling software. So when you design softwares like your AutoCADs or your Revits, and then once you've got the material that's coming out of a building and you know where it is and where it's come from, then you can actually work it into your design when you know when that building is going to reach end of life. So at the moment, we're right at the cutting edge of that, where we can denote the materials, we have their life cycle and what they've been used for. But then that next step is actually having a 3D idea of this element of a, so it could be a timber beam, it could be a window, it could be a door. Once you know those 3D parameters, you can actually add that into your building model and then work that into your construction program. And the information from that will be saved to go to the next, into the next life cycle. So for us, it was about doing it manually and actually tape measure. Yep, this will work. But in the future, and a lot of what we've designed here is everything as much as we could. We've used standardized sizing. So, 24 by 12 sheets. That way we know if there's a new material that we want to test, or we can take every part of the wall off, then we can actually have that same sheet to give back to someone that they can use.
Ali, I wonder if you had a response to that, given your depth of expertise in that innovation sector generally, regardless of this particular discussion, can you see comparable examples of where that type of scale has been achieved?
Yeah, there are some things to lean on there. I think that some of the Autodesk tools, by the way, could be useful for what you're looking for. But also there's some really interesting uses of AI. So Gringo is a group that's collecting plastic in Bali, preventing ocean plastic there, and using like the Google AI engine, are able to take pictures of just refuse and actually find out exactly which Danone product that is. And as a result, you have a couple of things that happen there, because then you have an EPR system where you can call up that brand and say, hey, you dropped something. By the way, we found this many of them in this period of time.
Come and pick them up.
They're ready for you to pick them up.
Yep.
But also then, by going to a bottler or something like that, you can also know exactly what the manufacturing parameters were that created it, what the actual item number of not just the product, but the actual resin or, the building blocks of that made that thing. And so frequently we've done that in ocean plastic research, is find out where's the local bottler, what kind of bags and stuff are they buying. That's the input, because we're finding the output. You tie those things together, and the more granularity you have on that, it's one thing to say this is PET. If I say it's blow molded PET, I go from maybe $300 a ton to maybe $700 a ton. If I can tell you the grade, if I can tell you it's Dow Chemicals PET at this, and it's this product number, I could probably sell it for a double again. So actually the value chain is completely built on information granularity. I mean, as much as you know about something, the much more value it has, and as a result, circularity starts happening. It's the problem of applying definition to something undefined that's really the most expensive part.
And that's and just a reminder, everyone, to drop some questions in the chat if you've got any, some really interesting threads of conversation here, and really keen to hear from the audience as well. But I think that goes to something you said earlier, Steve, about finding the markets and making sure that we're valuing things in the right way. I wonder how you're seeing that opportunity, again drawing back to construction waste in a specific sense, but even more broadly.
Yeah, my point was based around materials flows and trying to predict materials flows. There are companies doing that now, but I'm in the trenches when it comes to close the loop, and we're seeing collection of, for example, mixed soft plastics far outweighing any markets that might exist for products or new materials that can be made from that waste stream. So that materials flow analysis is critical, and some of the polymers that we're dealing with, these mixed soft plastics, is what we call the mongrel mix. So there's really no opportunity, as Ali has suggested, to get real value, because they're so heavily mixed and contaminated with multi layers, etc. Which is where if we can design out waste, if waste is a design flaw, which I believe it is, then we can go right back to the brand owners and start to look at design cosmetics, for example, cartridges, you know, they can all be impacted to have a much better reuse value if they're designed well.
And I suppose I've always loved following that 1,000-kilometer challenge with the recycling of toner cartridges for roads and what have you. You know, I wonder, are we getting to the point where the commercialization, the commercial realities of that technology applied is starting to move the needle? Is that your sense?
Yes, I do. There's still a stigma attached with recycling polymers, unfortunately. And that stigma is that virgin polymers have been used to improve the performance of asphalt all around the world since the 70s. But as soon as you can recreate those same characteristics from a recycled polymer, well, you're dumping trash in a horizontal landfill, aren't you? So, you know, we've got to overcome those stigmas, but we are moving the needle considerably. And there are now procurement guidelines, I believe, that are about to drop from a federal government level that include somewhere in the vicinity of 30% recycled content. And then we're going to see that needle move a lot more as well, Matt.
And Sophia, you know, your company's starting to get the economics, the business model of this, you know, right. What do you think for you has been the success of that? What are the drivers when you think about customers and supply chains for your work?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things we are thinking about the downstream customers, but we're actually really investigating decarbonizing whole industries and understanding what the transition is going to look like for different industries that, you know, don't have good options for low carbon technologies. The big interesting thing I believe right now is that, for instance, we have a big customer in Australia who is a nickel miner. And we went to them and we said, hey, we can bind our CO2 to any of your mine tailings that have magnesium in it. And so because we know from our research that we can bind CO2 to steel slags, to mine tailings, to all kinds of industrial wastes like incinerator bottom ash. So we've gone to different industries and said, like, do you have waste with these characteristics? And we were actually able to find that we can take all of their mine tailings and combine it with CO2 and then process that into stuff. Now, not only does that make money, as in create products that can be sold, but it also reduces a huge liability for mining companies that all have to incorporate that cost into the end of life of their mines. So it's actually I never expected this to be such a whole new way of looking at all different kinds of industries. I'm not sure
yeah, I mean it's awesome to see that that's heading to being economically viable, or even more so, right? And that's, I suppose, what innovation and technology can drive. I'm interested. There's a great question in the chat there from Tim Duff, who says IT and construction industries look like they're making some good progress. What industries are lagging? Where is there a lot of work to be done that really needs to be focused on? Who'd like to respond to that?
I think just a quick one on that. Industries that are lagging, I think there needs to be a bit more leadership from the government, because what we're finding over here is there's a mandate put on people who are involved in the demolition industry to sort and repurpose or recycle 95% of a building when it comes down. But there's no direct incentive or mandate on someone who's building a new road to use, say, for example, crushed construction and demolition waste as a road base. So where there's that opportunity, we need to, it's up to ourselves to specify what we're doing in our projects, but also I think that's where it's lagging, in my opinion, is to actually get some help in closing the loop, because unless you've got a responsibility to purchase recycled materials where you can have virgin materials at a cheaper cost, you'll still use them.
Any other thoughts from the group?
Yeah, I had one thought. Listen, the biggest recycling success story in the United States has come from office paper and also corrugated cardboard. And really that was driven by when the government decided that through its procurement offices that you had to have a certain percentage of recycled content in office paper. And it is so much simpler and easier to be able to have an industry shift when you have a giant procurement office saying it has to have that. All of a sudden, everybody wanted to have a recycled paper factory. Now, if in the same thing, when I look at traffic barrels in a seaside community that's worried about ocean plastic, how do we not make our traffic barrels out of ocean plastic, right? How do we not, and the government is procuring that. So I think the easiest and simplest lever that we can operate is in the procurement processes of the tax-funded offices that we have, that when they're buying traffic barrels or they're buying whatever it is, toner cartridges, et cetera, that recycled content has to be a part of that. And then you have industries saying, okay, I'm willing to take the chance now. I know this will be a long tail that I'll be able to get my investment back. Yeah, and that's that right incentive structure to start that, the dominoes going. And I know, Steve, you mentioned before that the state government are probably ahead of the game with where they're investing. Are you seeing that in their procurement strategies? Is that something that's starting to emerge very obviously?
Yes, most definitely. And a great example of that is a policy called Recycled First, which has been initiated by Major Road Projects Victoria. And that is driving real change. And then you've got groups like ISCA, who are, if you like, verifying the claims of all the suppliers that would like to supply into that. So there are precedents in place that are creating demonstrable change there, Matt. Yep.
Yeah, great. Usha, what would you reflect from what you're seeing in Europe and beyond about that question Tim Duff asked about industries that are lagging? Where is there real work to be done?
Across the full supply chain, really, Matt. I mean, on the one hand, taking the points that other people have raised already. On the one hand, you need to have a drive and a leadership through governments and the big companies, that invest in R&D and are prepared to make the change. But then you also need to think about, and particularly when you're thinking about the buildings and construction sector, you need to think about the subcontractor whose business is basically his ute. And so, how does a person like that really understand, and how does a person like that fit into changing a system where the bits of the cog are already well designed in place? And that's what, the youth man does. He does the same thing over and over again. So what support can be provided to people like him to change their business practices and to really understand where we are heading in this direction for a circular built environment? So I think it's really critical that that level of education, skill development. And I think, again, to sort of pick up on what Steve said, one of the concerns that certainly the Victorian government has expressed to some extent is, moving to circular economy is fine and good, but where are we going to be able to support people to get jobs in a circular economy? And that requires retraining and reskilling. And the point that Sophia made, in order to be able to come up with solutions, you really need to understand the problem before you come up with the solution. So you need that level of innovation and out of the box thinking as well. So it's really, multiple solutions to the problem across multiple scales.
And I mean, this draws us back to that. There's not a silver bullet, it's a systems thinking challenge, and where to put the right pressure on that system for change, incentives, regulation, procurement, policies, leadership from outside of our own domains. Where do we focus? And Ali, you talked a lot about that systems thinking when we first spoke, and again today. What do you think's if everyone's on this call today, they've got an interest in this topic, what can we each do to start to move that needle, think more about that, help the guy in the ute, as Usha said? What do you say? What do you think?
I think, listen, I think it is an all hands on deck type thing. Everyone has to contribute to that. I think thinking about Tim's scenario about, a construction building where you're substituting concrete for steel. What's interesting is there are other sectors that have huge influences that we don't normally think about. And as an example, I know in the Netherlands, there's been some buildings where the steel in a building is seen as an asset, not as an expense. So that when it's time for that building to be decommissioned, whatever it is, the bank says, I already have collateral in the form of, thousands of tons of steel. And so therefore your loan will be knocked down a certain amount because there's this asset sitting there. Right. And so if the finance sector can get into it and you can save maybe 20% of your loan because of that, you treated something as an asset instead of an expense, you might have 20% more budget to build something more sustainable. And so we have to think about, like, sometimes the unobvious solutions, can really be really powerful movers. And I think anytime we talk about the manufacturing industrial economies, we have to realize that behind all that, there's a loan. Someone has to loan money for that capital. And so I think it's fundamental in the circular economy is to think about the economy and financial instruments to reward that, and for everyone to start moving their books from thinking about expenses and moving everything into an asset column. I mean, imagine if Coca-Cola said all the Coke bottles that they produced is an asset, right, that they have to recover and manage. Well, it becomes a completely different way of thinking about things and treating that as an expense that's in a linear economy. I mean,
it's such a wonderful insight. I often think about insurance companies as well, of course. If we can, move the needle on how they think about what the risk reward ratios are for different things, there's immense potential there. Has anyone seen anything where those sorts of things are starting to come to the fore? The Netherlands, it sounds like they've got a couple of examples there. Any others that have come across?
Well, I mean, you can't throw out any bottles in Germany because they're worth money to you. So that's as an asset. When you go to a bar, and the first time that I did over there, I grabbed a beer, and at the end of it, I put it in a bin, and someone said to me, "Oh no, you've got the token." So you get a token when you get your beer, and then you return the token with the bottle in reward for cash at the end of it. And it's the same all across there with any drink bottle, and you return the crates when you finish with them. So for us, I think it's even getting back into glass and having a bottle that can get reused so many times. But that's definitely a thing where you treat your waste as money, because they'll withhold the money from you until they get it back.
So yeah, container deposit legislation on sort of steroids, to some extent is what we're talking about, right? Like it's how do you macro that up, and we've seen some good and perhaps not so good implementation of that nationally. But there's obviously wonderful opportunity there as well.
There's I'll just really quickly, there's another in the construction industry, Shaw Carpets, I think, really stands out as, they don't sell you a carpet, you have a floor covering service that's leased. And so anytime something needs to be, a carpet tile needs to go, and it sounds like it's found some great ones that you could just get for free, but in the leasing service, that also means that, every time you're replacing a tile, you're getting it back. And I tell you what, when you work with a manufacturer that knows what they put into it will come back to them, they're less likely to put PVC, toluene, and all the nasty adhesives that are going to poison their own workers. So you actually make things better.
Which again just ties back to just the complexity of the systems thinking we need to do to go back through there. Look, this has been an awesome conversation. I know that the second part of this is upon us, so I might pass across to Rachel and Adina and help them lead us through the next part of the webinar.
Yes, the unplugged version. So we're going to stop recording now. Thank you so much to our contributors for letting us eavesdrop on what was a fascinating conversation. There's so many more questions and suggestions in the chat. So we're about to move into a more informal discussion where people can come on and ask directly and offer their thoughts. So thank you to all of you for joining us. If you need to jump off the line, please do so now. Thank you to our contributors, and we'll stop recording.